我们是从山西太原。
我们从广西过来的。
我是在鼓浪屿住第13代。
我来自中国福建省三明市。
我们是从新加坡来的。
Singapore and China, separate countries, separate people. And yet, we all call ourselves Chinese. What really is the meaning of being Chinese? 当华人是什么意思？
这个问题很 tricky 了，不知道怎么讲。对我华人的意义，我觉得这个问题怎么讲呢？不懂怎么回答了。
What does it mean to be Chinese? Our question was not one that could be easily answered. As Singaporeans, we felt that going to China could help us find some answers. After all, China is the motherland. It was from there that the Chinese went forth to different parts of the world.
To search for the meaning of being Chinese in Singapore is like eating the bao without the tau sa. You just don't get the whole picture. So we decided to go to China.
The Chinese heritage has always seemed like just a distant past. My first visit was last year to Beijing and Shanghai. You would think that someone who speaks Mandarin and who celebrates Chinese New Year would feel some kind of affinity with China.
I often think about my grandparents and their lives before Singapore. When he was young, my grandfather left his village in Swatao for Southeast Asia. I often wonder about the family he left behind. Is being Chinese still something that can draw us together?
Similarly, seeing more PRCs around coffee shops, shopping centers, and MRTs made me increasingly interested in Chineseness, as I wondered if we had more in common than just facial features. So after feeling very out of place among people who looked and spoke the same as me, I was curious why this sense of alienation was so real.
And although we share the same roots, how different are Singapore Chinese from China Chinese?
Are we more similar or different?
We had different motivations but a common question. The charm of root seeking led us to start with places we thought would be most familiar. Guangzhou, Shantou, Xiamen, the homelands of our ancestors. We wanted to encounter the place and the people firsthand, to hear their stories as we wrote our own.
So for 3 weeks, we travelled through the crowded, rural and foreign, encountering different dialects, food and ways of life. But still, the most special encounters we had were with the people.
你们从哪里走过来的？路玩过来的？
我们从新加坡。
哇！你们新加坡人啊？
对对对。
Our conversations were unplanned and unexpected. Every day, we hoped that someone would come our way, willing to share. We had many days of failure and some days of success.
A theatre producer, a policewoman, a seamstress. Each conversation brought us to another world, a life full of stories. What is the meaning of being Chinese? We received an array of responses. Some were visibly stumped. Others directed us to history, books, old films, for us to understand what makes the Chinese people.
中国的文化对不对？它的背景，它的历史，这是必须的，这是必须的。不然的话，那你自己是一个口头上的中国人。
Others brought up an innate quality. You are Chinese because it is in your blood. You cannot change that. 改不了。
我这边是华人，所以这对我来讲说不重要，因为我改变不了，我怎么样都是华人，不管我去哪里都是华人，就是这样。
You are Chinese because of your skin tone, face shape, nose and eyes.
To others, the answer was simple.
在我们中国人眼里来说，中国人和华人没有什么区别，只是一个代名词。
All Chinese belong to China and will one day return to their homelands. So along the way, we realized that our question was in fact twofold. 意思 or meaning could firstly refer to what is the meaning or definition of Chinese, and secondly, what is meaningful about being Chinese?
This was why the question intrigued and mattered so much. We were not just searching for definitions, but for the significance of being Chinese. In exploring our ancestral hometowns, we could choose if these spaces and people were personal enough to remain part of our identities.
I guess I don't feel much because this is the first time being in Tongan. Maybe it was my grandfather's hometown after all, not mine.
Could our grandparents' hometowns become ours as well?
Perhaps the Chinese people identify with each other because they relate on some personal level. Yet everyone relates differently, some through language, others through food, culture, or history. In our encounters, we related with the Chinese identity mostly through lineage, language, and culture.
你在改变说我不是中国人，那是不可能的，因为你血统还存在着，要记住这一点。
We met him in Zubatun, Xiamen, a village for Huatiaos. Although he was born in Indonesia, Mr. Zuba migrated back to China when he was young. While he still enjoys Indonesian coffee and cuisine, Mr. Zuba believes that he will always be Chinese because of his blood.
你不要忘记哦，你再改变你也改变不了你的那个祖宗三代，哦，这个是应该这么讲，而不能说我为什么要改变，没有这个道理。
Lineage traverses nationality, choice, and other circumstances to define who we really are. Our ancestors were Chinese, so we are Chinese. It was that simple. Yet blood as an identity marker is never straightforward. Mr. Chupa, for example, has slightly more tan skin than other Chinese people we met because he grew up in sunny Surabaya.
说你们进入印尼去，但是你们的姓氏永远不会改变你是中国血统，对不对？你在印尼，他也还是承认你是。
To define Chinese identity by lineage is complex also when we consider people of mixed heritage. Are they half Chinese, a quarter, or some other percentage of it? Lineage is so significant to the Chinese that almost everyone we met in China appreciated our attempt at root seeking. They emphasized the importance of ancestry, family ties, and gratitude.
那重要的是出生的地方。
对，对，像你们这次寻根之旅，我觉得很鼓励，这个是对的。
There were also some, however, who were painfully aware that root seeking may not always be as romantic and revealing as it's painted to be.
寻根其实这是人的一个最终心理的一个归属，其实没有太多意义。就像你们一样，可能我是祖辈广州来了，然后我就回来看一下。其实你回来什么都看不到，就是 nothing。如果有一个人带你去看，你看这个房子100多年了，以前你们就住在这里，你只能说no sense， 也看不到，人家对你也不了解，你对他也不了解。
Perhaps the roots that we are seeking is just like the concept of lineage. They are romanticized concepts that, while initially appealing, are ultimately elusive.
Then there was the Chinese language. Mandarin, or Putonghua, literally means common speak, allowing many dialect groups to communicate and share a common identity. When I went back to my grandparents' hometown in Shanghai, the Teochew dialect felt both familiar and foreign. I hear and know Teochew, but never learn it. Like my grandparents, however, people in Shantou only spoke Teochew growing up.
Globally, Mandarin often solidifies the Chinese identity, but within China, numerous dialect groups make up the very same identity. Little ironies like this made our question ever more complex.
Our friend Jinta spoke Teochew everywhere except in school, at work, and with us. He often calls himself a Shantou Ren rather than a Huaren, mostly because Huaren is obvious.
为什么你们会认为自己是华人，而不认为自己是新加坡人？
Other people we met also identified that way. Guangyu, Guangxi, Guangzhou, Shanxi, their hometowns where they grew up with specific dialects. This was what made them, them.
Buses in Xiamen prescribe values. Like language, values shape identity. It's widely believed that a Chinese person should exemplify filial piety, patriotism, and the list goes on. But am I truly Chinese only with these ideals? The Chinese culture nurtures these values at home and in schools, organically and institutionally. In such a climate, Chineseness seems most dependent on upbringing. On the other hand, is culture really the answer to what it means to be Chinese? It decides so much, from language to habits. Yet we as individuals have active choice in areas like language, and in a way can access another culture as easily. Are we Chinese just because we can identify with a culture?
But often when we exercise choice, society overlooks it for something more convenient. Mr. Zhu Ba fiercely identifies as Chinese, but many determine from his appearance that he is not. How much then does choice influence identity, and especially Chinese identity, when society tends to decide on a superficial level?
Looking Chinese, whatever that means, often came up in our conversations synonymous with being Chinese. Checking the looks box allowed us to easily blend in and strike conversation with locals while in China. While we were exploring lineage, language, and culture in making sense of our Chinese identities, we were often labeled Chinese simply by looking the part. How much do looks influence the way society perceives our identity?
While we think we choose our identities, society often imposes its own expectations. Our identity then becomes both a personally and socially construed complex. Perhaps the visually heavy nature of being Chinese sets it apart from religious, national, and other types of identity.
Part of our difficulty was in our methods. We went to many places and heard many stories, but could never know all of China, nor savor all its egg tarts and doujiang. What about the village lady who couldn't understand our Putonghua, or the military guy ordered not to speak? We were just skimming the surface of a vast sea of 1 billion people. To realize the limitations of our project was also to recognize the immensity of China. The task is really too big, and the place almost impossible to know.
那你觉得华人和其他国家的人有什么特色？那我没做过，我没有比较。对。
Another part of our challenge was the question itself. In a country so big that its people hardly go overseas, there was a tendency to be insular. Many people that we met tend to conflate nationality and a Chinese identity.
你觉得华人跟中国人有这两个词有什么分别呢？还是一样的？我觉得是一样的呀。啊，就是中国人呀。啊，我的祖宗就是中国人呀。对。
But by simply equating the Chinese identity and Chinese nationality, the Chinese identity is reduced to China's national narrative. What then about the Singapore Chinese, the American Chinese, the Chinese who aren't part of China?
Kinmen's a place geographically closer to China, and yet officially Taiwanese. It straddles the line between different kinds of Chineseness. In Kinmen, we met Mark, One of those on the periphery, the Chinese who aren't officially part of China. Mark believes that we, Singaporean Chinese, China Chinese, Taiwanese Chinese, are just different types of Chinese.
你觉得哪一部分的华人才是最真正的华人呢？
华人哦，
对，可以算是最真正的。没有，那怎么
你们一点点，我们一点点，大家都一点点。哦。没有一个你能说啊，我是正宗，没有。
We all have some Chineseness in us, but no one can truly claim to be the most authentic.
So what really lies at the heart of our question? What lies at the heart of identity? We think that it is to belong, to find a sense of familiarity in a world that often confounds and isolates. Even when traveling in a foreign place, we still felt 亲切感, an inexplicable sense of familiarity with people that we met.
So it seems to be Chinese is really belonging to a community, a group of people. It doesn't really matter what dialect you speak or country you come from. Maybe it doesn't even matter how much choice you have in deciding to be Chinese. In spite of these differences, identifying is knowing that you are part of a larger whole, a larger story.
And perhaps that is the meaning we seek. The significance of being Chinese, as with any other group or ideology or belief we commit to, is to belong. Like getting to know someone, getting to know a place and an identity takes time. We slowly realize that China is not the elusive motherland, and the Chinese identity is not just a concept.
Where do the theories, speculations, and ideas end, and the lives of real people begin?
那我觉得一个人活着的意思就是当华人的意思嘛，不管你是哪一个国家的人。我觉得父母给了我们生命，我们就要热爱生命。
Our question was more than a romanticized exploration. It was beautifully captured in our encounters with everyday people. The people we met and the people they reminded us of. And for sure, they were what we came to learn and love the most.
认也好，不认也好，你记得也好，你不记得也好，重要的是每一个人不管在什么地方都是要生活下去。